So, Tim, the first question is what aspects of the current family justice, youth justice, and child welfare systems act as obstacles to achieving good outcomes for young people who are in those systems?
Well, I think it varies according to which bits of the system that you look at, and my expertise is primarily in relation to youth justice. So I'll start there, but I may have a few comments in relation to other aspects of the system. And I think certainly within the youth justice system, the primary obstacle to achieving long-term better outcomes is that the approaches and interventions with children are primarily based around assumptions of the necessity of punishment. And those, I think, are also located in a kind of like fairly deeply held assumption about the types of kids who come into contact with the youth justice system. And there is a sense, I think, in which those assumptions are predicated on a view that children who offend are somehow less deserving than other children who who might be in need of various forms of support. I'll give an example in relation to that, which is the age of criminal responsibility. And as you may be aware, children are held criminally liable from the age of 18. In other words, we assume that they are sufficiently mature and responsible to take responsibility for their own actions from that particular age. And if you compare that with other assumptions about children's maturity, it looks really odd. For instance, as you'll be aware, legislation precludes children from buying tobacco or alcohol until the age of 18, and that's presumably on the basis that we don't think they're sufficiently mature to make decisions about their intake of those potentially harmful substances. So for children in general, 18 is regarded as an age when they become sufficiently mature to be held accountable for their decision making, to take responsibility for their health and their behaviour. But if they break the criminal law, for some reason that age is depressed. And from the age of 10, there is an assumption that they are sufficiently mature to be held fully liable for their behaviour. And I think that kind of assumption, which informs the age of criminal responsibility, then permeates throughout the whole of the system. It results, I think, in poor outcomes for nearly every child who comes into the youth justice system, relative to the outcomes that would be achieved if they were given support outside that system. So I think that's kind of like where I'd start in relation to the youth justice system. I know less about the family justice system, but I'm aware that they operate according to quite different dynamics, which is an interesting thing, I think. So, for example, you would anticipate that the youth justice system and the care system were both indicators of the level of vulnerability among children in society. So you would anticipate that throughput would fluctuate in tandem. And that isn't the way that things work at all. So, for instance, over the last decade or so, there's been a marked reduction in the number of children coming into the youth justice system. And at the same time, there has been a rapid increase in the number of children coming into the care system, which suggests that they operate according to different dynamics. They're not straightforward indicators of children's the level of need among children within society. One of the things which I become increasingly aware of is the damaging impact of coming into contact with a formal system. So to the extent that you can transfer learning from the youth justice system to the family justice system, I think what stands out as being a problem or an obstacle is the fact that intervention, often when it comes quite late. And by that time, families and children are frequently quite resistant to accepting the support that they may, had it been offered earlier and in a different manner, might have been quite willing to accept and to work with. So the family justice system is often, I think, more antagonistic, confrontational than it needs to be, because families have frequently been asking for support for many years, told they don't reach the threshold for that kind of support, and then when things get to a crisis point, an intervention is foisted upon them.
Okay, thank you. There's a lot there to be thinking about. Just to go back to your comment on the rising numbers of adolescents coming into care and the falling numbers coming into youth justice, could you argue that that's a kind of recognition more that children are in need of protection, safeguarding? But you clearly, or is it that something else is going on there? How do you interpret that?
Well, I think there's a number of things that potentially help to explain it. I mean, one of the straightforward ones, I think, is that there's been a shift in targets in relation to the youth justice system, which has meant that there are incentives for agencies not to use that particular mechanism for dealing with particular forms of social problems. And if that's the case, if children who were previously being dealt with in the youth justice system no longer are, then they may be more likely to come to the attention of other systems, who then have to, if you like, step in and pick up the pieces. But I think that has gone alongside a reconceptualization, which is a fairly recent development in relation to how society understands some forms of children's behaviour. And I'm thinking in particular of the way that child sexual exploitation has become a relatively dominant narrative in the field of children's care. And as a consequence of that, a lot of behaviours that would have been interpreted or dealt with as criminal are now recognised as being an indication of victimisation. And on the back of that, there's been an increasing move to expand that sort of understanding to what increasingly is now referred to as child criminal exploitation. So kids getting involved in gangs, for example, are now sometimes, not by any means always, but are sometimes regarded as victims of exploitation rather than perpetrators of offending behaviour. So I think the overlap and the links between the two systems, which at one level are quite, in our society, in England and Wales, are quite distinct. The overlaps tend to operate according to how different types of behaviour by children are constructed or understood by society at any particular time.
And you also commented on sort of the lack of support early on. Is that something that you think is a problem with both systems, both youth justice or do you think it's not so much the systems, it's other things that need to be stepping in earlier?
Well, I think in terms of the youth justice system, I suspect that the youth justice system, if earlier support, appropriate levels of support was available, the youth justice system would have pretty little to do. And providing we recognise and are able to tolerate as a society a certain amount of acting out by teenagers, which I think at the moment we are probably getting a bit better at doing as a society. But during the 1990s and early 2000s, we were very poor as a society at being tolerant of children's testing boundaries and things like that, and regarded any indication of what became known as antisocial behaviour as deeply problematic. So I think if we had suitable levels of early support, I suspect that the need for the youth justice system would shrink considerably. I think obviously there are going to be always instances where families struggle continually despite being given lots of support early on. There will be inevitably a spectrum of need and how support is accepted, or how agencies are able to work with different families. That I think we could do much better if we were proactive, supportive, recognise differences, and didn't have. Again, I think this is something which spans both the family justice and the youth justice systems, sense in which support is dependent upon responsibility. So there's an unhelpful, I think, assumption that rights and responsibilities are somehow conditional on each other. And I think if we want to improve outcomes for children, we need to get away from the idea that people's rights are somehow dependent on them, on responsibility, or them conforming in particular ways with expectations which particular agencies may have in relation to them.
Thanks. That's all very helpful. I'm going to move on now to the second question. We may come back to all of these things if we have time. But can you identify, we've said 3, but they could be less, could be more, important things you feel are worth keeping in the current systems, both whether that's family justice, youth justice, child welfare, things that are helpful now that, in your view, or could be with a bit of a tweak?
Okay, I suppose both systems do or are characterised by an increasing focus on children's rights, which I think has been a positive development across the board, and is something which, although in some respects underdeveloped, has real potential, I think, for making a difference in the way that support to children is offered. And allied to that, I think the increased focus on hearing the voice of the child, which is clearly one of the important rights which they have, has I think contributed to improved practice both within family justice and within youth justice, and although it could clearly be improved and expanded upon, and sometimes might be regarded as tokenistic, the idea that children's participation is an important element of any form of support giving or intervention with children and their families, I think is a really positive development. And third, I suppose, and in some respects, essential, a prerequisite of doing the other two well, is that there has, I think, been a renewed interest in the importance of relationships between service providers and those to whom they provide services. So within youth justice, we do this pretty badly, I think, but at least people are now talking about the relationship between the youth offending team worker and the child as being important, and a clear prerequisite of effective forms of intervention. I think the family justice system probably does that a bit better and has had a longer term recognition of the importance of relationship. But again, I suspect that there is substantial scope for improvement there too. And one of the things which I guess sometimes gets in the way of it is kind of like what might be termed professionalism. And there is some, I mean, clearly there it's a question of degree. The line has to be drawn somewhere. But there is something about the increased professionalization of social work, of youth justice work, which I think has tended to get in the way of, let's say, caring relationships. The notion of caring, of befriending, are ones which, to a degree, have been a little bit frowned upon as being perhaps unprofessional. And I think that we need to ensure that professionalism allows for caring too.
Thank you. Well, that's a very interesting point. Do you want to say a little bit more about that, which is that somehow being that you are prevented from caring or you're diverted from caring because I'd just be interested to hear a bit more about how you think that interferes with that.
Well, I can give some anecdotal stuff, perhaps historical, from within the criminal justice system, which shows how far things have shifted, I guess. And some of those changes are clearly important and valid, but it also shows a little bit about where there is potential for loss too. So, for example, when I first qualified as a social worker, I did a placement as part of my social work training within a probation team, and at that time, the idea, or there was an expectation that when you finished an order with someone, when someone completed their probation order, that you would invite them down the pub and buy them a drink, and the money you spent on that was claimable against expenses. Now, given that misuse of alcohol was actually a problem for a lot of the probationers, it wasn't necessarily a great idea. But it also pointed to something really important, which was about a recognition that these people had paid their debt to society, the power imbalance which existed within a probation order was no longer appropriate, that they had somehow were now your equal. And that kind of idea, I think, was an important one which was lost. The probation service at that time used to have as one of its statutory functions befriending. It's now a punishment agency. And that befriending was a real thing. So I don't know if you recall the case of Mary Bell, who was a girl who murdered some very young children, sort of in a generation prior to the Bolger case. She spent a few years in Holloway, and when she was ultimately released, it was with a new identity. She had no family to speak of. She had no friends. She had no community to go back to. So there's an issue about where she would go to live and how she would rejoin society. And she went to live with her probation officer. The probation officer had her in a spare room. Now, today that would be regarded as completely unprofessional for very good reasons, I think, but it does indicate how far we've gone in the other direction. We've bent the stick, potentially much too far. And I think the same could be said in relation to children's social care and children's social work as well. I mean, I did work years ago in children's residential care, and at that stage there was a real kind of like debate about whether we could hug the kids. And increasingly there was a presumption that you wouldn't touch children at all. Now, of course, there were very, very important safeguards that underpinned that shift, but I think that we lost something along the way too.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you also think we might have lost something by wholesale moving away from residential care for adolescents?
Well, I think there's a problem in relation to the residential care that we've got. So, I mean, different children will have a whole range of different needs and will feel comfortable in different forms of provision. And certainly a lot of teenagers that I talk to do not, at that stage in life, want an alternative family. And they've got a family who, for whatever reason, they can't live with, and find it difficult to come to terms with the fact that they are placed with an alternative family. So from the point of view of what children want, I think we do need to be open to having a range of provision. And you'll probably know that what has happened historically is there was a wholesale shift to close children's homes, and to transfer resources to family placements. Now, the corollary of that was that where, for those kids who did require some form of residential provision, that was required, we became completely dependent on private sector provision. We came completely dependent on provision, which was to a large degree provided on the basis of generating a profit, and frequently is not located where children want to be. So there is a situation in relation to a particular cohort of teenagers, in particular those who perhaps are the hardest to place, who are then placed in substandard, frequently residential provision out of the local authority which is responsible for them. There is, as a consequence of that frequent breakdown, they are moved around the sector, they become harder and harder to place. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And that, it seems to me, is as a consequence of an assumption that that all children should somehow be able to fit into family placements.
Yes, interesting. I mean, it also linked to the professionalism point you made earlier, because there was a lot of concern, wasn't there, of the lack of qualification of residential staff?
Yes, and my view is that that it should be regarded as an incredibly highly skilled professional piece of work. And I think if it was framed in that way, if it was well rewarded, you would actually attract quite a lot of people, because there are some very, very potentially rewarding bits of work you can do as a residential social worker. You get to know the children so much better than you do as a kind of like field social worker, because you just spend a great deal of your time with them, you live with them. And certainly when you look at secure children's homes, where there is an expectation of that most staff are qualified, there is a recognition that they're doing a highly skilled job, then I think you do see that kind of dynamic, that you attract high quality staff, and the respect which is then shown to the provision is a positive circle and the outcomes, given how damaged the children inevitably who go into secure care are pretty good, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with you on that. Secure children's homes are a lot better than one expects when you get into them.
Yeah, I'm actually I do see you see elements of practice which perhaps you could be critical of, but whenever I go to a secure children's home, I actually come out feeling quite buoyed and quite positive about what's going on there and about the relationships between the staff and the children. And the children themselves are frequently incredibly positive about the staff. A few years ago, I was seconded to the office of the Children's Commissioner for a while. And as part and parcel of that, we did a number of unannounced visits to secure children's homes and interviewed kids to find out what they were thinking about things. And I was very struck by one teenage boy who, in the course of the interview, we explained that we wouldn't pass on what he'd said if we didn't want us to, that we'd respect confidentiality, etc. And he said, no, I want you to tell the staff what I've got to say about them. And then he just launched into saying how fantastic they were, how he bought a Father's Day card for the guy who was the manager of the home because he regarded him in that kind of way as somebody who was acting as a dad should. So, yeah, I think that at their best, they perform really, really well.
Thank you. That's a positive. Dan, do you want to ask your question? And then if we have more to come back to wrap up, we can come back after that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Mary. Hello, Tim. How are you?
I'm not bad, thanks, Dan. You?
Yes, I'm good. My question is, what is your vision for how things could work better for adolescents?
Well, I suppose that one important consideration is about ambition. And by that, I mean the ambition that systems have for teenagers. It's very clear, I think, in relation to youth justice, which, as I've said, is my area that I know best. But there, the kind of like primary ambition, which is enshrined in legislation, is to stop the kids offending. Now, that is an incredibly negative ambition for those groups of children, just that they don't break the law for a year. I mean, nothing about what they should be able to look forward to, what we aspire for those kids in future, their sort of positive, happy, fulfilling lives. Now, clearly, I think the childcare system isn't quite so constrained in those ways, but I do think the practice and the way that assessments are framed are still dominated by risk aversion. So the safeguarding is frequently about reducing and minimizing risks, rather than looking forward to where the kids are going to be in 10 years' time and how they can be supported to live and develop really fulfilling lives. Now, of course, some of the work does operate in that way, but I think there is still undertones of focusing on risk rather than long-term well-being.
Thank you. That was good.
Oh, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah, take it as a compliment.
Is there anything else you want to follow up on, Dan, that you've heard Tim talk about? Anything that struck you disagree with or you'd like to hear more about?
Tim, what's the difference between a residential and a field social worker?
Okay, well, in terms of the jobs that they do, a residential worker is, as I understand it, is somebody who is primarily based within a residential children's home, and so they would spend their time actually doing the day-to-day living with, looking after children who live in those facilities. A field social worker, perhaps it's an old-fashioned term these days, but is I guess what might be referred to more frequently now as a case manager. So they will be a qualified social worker, but who works in the field as a case manager. So they have an overview of their caseload, but will actually spend considerably less time with the child. They will make the decisions, perhaps. They will be the budget holders sometimes, perhaps. But the extent of interaction with the child, young person, will be considerably less. And I think in terms of that, thinking about it, I think that it's fairly clear too that over time, if you think about that group of staff, those who are case managers, the amount of time that they've actually spent with families and children by comparison with the amount of time that they would have been expected to spend with them at one point, is considerably less. I think there is a lot more emphasis on paperwork and process, on conducting and making sure that they recorded assessments, etc., and so on and so forth. And case managers manage cases rather than develop relationships with people. And I think that's, I don't know if that's answered the question or gone rather in a different direction. But come back to me if you want me to.
No, that's fine. Thank you.
I had a couple of things I was interested in. Right at the start, you talked about the age of responsibility for crime being 10. And so I'm wondering if in a vision for how things would be better, you would be wanting to change that.
Certainly. And I mean, a number of considerations, I suppose, in relation to it. One relates to what I was saying about children's rights, and the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child has made it very clear that they think anything below the age of 14 is unacceptable and constitutes a breach of the UN Convention. So I would think that anything under 14 is incompatible with the child rights approach. And as I said, I think that's a really important consideration. I mean, my own view is that these things, decisions in relation to these, are inevitably a little arbitrary. Inevitably as a question of balance. And I know some of my colleagues would say, well, we should have an age of criminal responsibility of 18, given that children should be recognised as children and they should be kept out of the criminal justice system altogether. I think there may be some dangers in relation to that, because that kind of argument might also then be deployed to reduce children's participation in other ways. So, for example, if you're interested in arguing that young people should be able to vote from the age of 16, which I might be, then it would be a bit odd for me to say, but I don't think they're sufficiently mature to be held accountable for their behaviour until they're 18. So it's about ensuring that there is consistency across the piece. And I guess my position is that it makes sense to align the age of criminal responsibility with the age of consent. So wherever society sets the age of consent, then I would think that it makes sense to set the age of criminal responsibility at the same age, because it indicates a view of how mature kids have to be in order to make decisions about important elements of their life. So I would think, while we have an age of consent, which is 16, that should be the age of criminal responsibility too.
Thank you. Yeah, that's helpful. Another area I'd be quite interested to discuss a bit more, because I share your view about secure children's homes, but it's not shared by some people would say children should never be confined. But we are seeing, obviously, with the groups of children coming into the care system now, very, very vulnerable children. And I'm just wondering what your view about that is, whether we do need a system that actually restricts liberty for children or not, and if so, how we might manage that better.
Well, I think that any system for restricting liberty should be as a last resort, but I think it's unrealistic to suggest that you can avoid restricting liberty of all children at all times. So I think it should be a very, very small number. Although having said that, I suspect that we probably need more secure children's homes places than we currently have. There's been a huge shrinkage in that sector, which has resulted in kids from England being placed in Scotland. So I think last I looked, about a third of secure places in Scotland were English children, which I think is appalling. It's resulted in increased use of things of deprivation of liberty orders, where kids are put in completely inappropriate circumstances with a high degree of restrictions on their liberty as a consequence of a lack of properly resourced secure provision. So I do think we do need a secure children's home sector, and it probably needs to be a bit bigger than it currently is. But I think what's really important is that where it is necessary to restrict children's liberty, that there is a clear route for removing them from that secure provision. And one of the things which I think is completely lacking at the current time is any vision for how we get the kids out of secure provision. So far too frequently, children are placed insecure at a time of crisis. Everybody breathes a sigh of relief because the problem has for a period of time gone away. But the problem is still there when that period of secure comes to an end. And all too often, I think, kids come out and are placed in some completely unsuitable provision when they do so, and it's no surprise that before long they're back inside a secure children's home. And so I think we do need and this comes back to an earlier discussion, a kind of like an expansion in very, very high quality residential provision, which will allow secure care to be a short-term stepping stone on the way to something which allows children to flourish in the community.
Thank you. That's really helpful. Dan, have you got anything else you want to follow up on?
I haven't. No, that's all great.
Okay, because I think that's been really helpful, Tim. I think you've covered a lot there, despite not knowing the questions in advance.
It was probably an advantage.
I don't know whether anyone else lurking here, like Beth or Seth, wants to ask any further questions, but I think I think you've been really helpful. Thank you.
Okay, Mary, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. Hi. That was brilliant. And you have already, I feel, touched on this in loads of ways, but you said that you thought that early support would shrink the need for the youth justice support system. And
yes.
And I just wondered if you might elaborate, because you have also then, even in your last point, talked about ways and the forms that could take. But I wondered if there's other things that you could add to how we might do that.
Well, I suppose the way that I've come to that view is from the other end of the telescope, if you like. So, as someone who's spent quite a lot of time working in and looking at the youth justice system, it's clear to me that the large majority of children who spend any time in that system are ones who've been let down considerably by adults for very, very many years before they get into the youth justice system. So I suppose that's the way that I've come to that view, and it's frequently failures by a range of different agencies which have occurred prior to children getting to the situation where they come to the attention of the police. So nearly by this, for instance, if you look at the group of kids who are sentenced to custody, it's something like 90% who have been excluded from school and effectively have nothing to do during the day. And it's hardly surprising that that group of kids, if they've got nothing to do during the day, will spend considerable amount of time on the streets mixing with other young people in a similar situation. And it's hardly surprising in those circumstances that that kind of street life, if you like, leads them to come into regular contact with the police. So our education system, I think, is one which lets down children very quickly who pose challenges for that system. And if we wanted to, for example, understand why black kids in particular are hugely overrepresented in the youth justice system, one of the reasons would be that levels of exclusion for black kids are much, much higher. I think a similar story can be told frequently in terms of children's social care, because it's clear that in nearly all cases that I've looked at where children are at the higher reaches of the youth justice system, where nasty things are happening to them, where the courts are imposing fairly vicious sentencing, that those kids have been known for a long time to children's services, but have had no sustained supportive interventions. Frequently, they're not meeting thresholds. Where there are concerns about potential emotional well-being, then referrals to child and adolescent mental health services are ones which are predicated on ridiculous thresholds. They're predicated on children showing motivation to attend appointments, and if they don't attend, then the case is closed. And you see that kind of story repeated over and over again. Certainly, I mean, I think I should be clear that the kind of like stuff that I've looked at is from a particular perspective. So it's children in care who are simultaneously getting into lots of trouble with the youth justice system, and so it's important too, I think, to say that the majority of children in care don't fall into that category. So it's a particular cohort who straddle both systems that I've looked at. But for that group, there is a sense in which it is apparent that the care system actually makes it more likely that they will offend, that they will come into contact with the criminal justice system, and they will find it hard to take up support, and that is the kind of factors that I think lead to that are ones which we've already talked about, which is a lack of high quality residential provision in their own communities. It's a lack of consistency in relation to caring relationships with their social workers. It's the fact that they're regarded as problem children, and when a placement is arranged, when they're out of the authority, that's met with a sigh of relief rather than an indication of failure. They're a group of kids who certainly feel that they are not listened to, that things are done to them rather than with them. And I guess that those kinds of, that combined, those things make it much more likely that the kids will run away, that they will not be happy in wherever they're placed, that they will regard themselves as increasingly as kids who have to look after themselves because no one else will look after them and people aren't listening to what they're saying. And as a consequence of having to look after themselves, will do what it takes to survive in what they see as hostile environments. And frequently that will mean doing things which will bring them into contact with criminal justice agencies.
Thank you.
Would you mind if, because one of the parts of one of our questions that we haven't necessarily elaborated on, but you have certainly touched upon your very concise answers, but is there a specific part of the system that you feel needs to die gracefully?
Die gracefully?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know about it being graceful, but I do think that the sense which certainly is fundamentally embedded in the youth justice system, but I suspect also can be found in the worst reaches of the care system, is a sense that these children are somehow other, that they're not like us, and I think there's a sense in which professional assessments are frequently used or framed in a way which is looking to identify what is different about these children. Why aren't they like us? Why don't they behave like our kids? And so certainly within youth justice, until very recently, this was very clearly focused on there are 12 domains of risk. Which ones are the ones which we need to fix with these kids? And I suspect that there is a similar thing in relation to the care system as well, particularly those children who are regarded as hard to place and who get shipped out of their communities, who have a succession of failed placements. There is a sense in which somehow these are a different sort of child to the mainstream children that we know and love. And so I think there's a sense in which, I don't know, regarding these children as somehow our children, being able to care for them in the way that we would care for other children in living in our own homes is something which it's difficult. I know it's difficult, but it's something which I think has the potential to dramatically improve outcomes.
Thank you. Do you see a way that we could sort of, is there something particular that would stop that othering, that might bring the thing about us belonging to each other and having shared humanity? What particularly might bring that back?
I think I think there have been some positive moves. I think that although as I said in relation to some of the conversations with Mary, I don't think that that we should be looking to lock up many children. I think at least secure children's homes provide a model of how that caring relationships can be done and promoted. Because my sense when I go into those places is there is a real strong sense of caring. There is a real strong sense of it being important to go the extra mile for these children. And I think that the growing professionalism, which I talked about earlier, although it's emerged for very understandable reasons and has been associated with important safeguards, has also undermined to a degree the expectation that professionals care about the children that they work with. And I think we need to expect that professionals who work with children and young people spend lots of time with them. And we expect that of teachers, we expect it of residential social workers. Less and less do we expect it of case managers, whether they're in the family justice system or the youth justice system. The potential for high quality relationships is clearly reduced if the amount of quality time you spend with children is limited. And the main focus of the job should be spending time with the kids.